Okay, I think maybe this is a good time to start. Yeah, so I think the participants are still coming in at this moment. And welcome, colleagues. And I'm Ying. I'm on behalf of the whole AUM team, the scientific committee and the co-conveners. I would like to welcome you to the 7th session in the Applied Urban Modeling 2020 conference. And in this particular session, we're going to look at mobility, urban and perhaps regional and possibly also national, as you will see. And here we have two distinguished speakers. And the first speaker is Professor Joseph Ferreira. Joseph, or Joe, has been a founding director of MIT's Computer Resource Lab and a long time user of computer systems, actually, to model cities. And he's currently the head of urban information systems at MIT. Joe, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Sure. I've been on the faculty at MIT for longer than most participants have been alive, starting out with electrical engineering, computer science, and operations research, but moved into urban planning with an interest in policy analysis. And I've been in the urban studies and planning department for a while, including getting involved in urban analytics and sort of big data before it was called big data, and continue to be involved with that, including in the new urban science undergrad program that we have combined with computer science and urban planning, and have been involved in this smart future of mobility research project that I'll talk a little bit about later on with other faculty at MIT over the last several years.
Fantastic, Joe. Well, this is the perspective of looking at these changes and also the potential transformations of urban mobility, right? So our second speaker is Professor Kai Axhausen. Professor Axhausen is a professor of transport planning at the ETH Zurich, or the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. And Professor Axhausen also worked actually in several countries before that. Kai, would you like to say something about yourself? Kai, you're muted.
Yes, I've been on the faculty at ETH since '99, and before that I spent some time in Austria, in Innsbruck, and in the UK, both as 4 years at Imperial and 2 years at Oxford. My focus has been on the measurement and modeling of travel behavior ever since, and we have also then translated these behavioral insights into agent-based modeling, and the MUTSIM project has dominated the last 20 years to a large extent, and it is now one of the better used agent-based transport models. This is joint work with a colleague from Berlin, Kai Nagel, and my PhD student and his PhD students.
And in the audience, there will be actually people who have actually used the MUTSIM, so I'm pretty sure. Yeah. And both at the faculty and the student levels. And for our discussant of the session, we're really fortunate to have Professor Corinne Mulley, who was the inaugural chair for public transport at the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies at the University of Sydney, and she's a transport economist and always very interested in the questions of behavior and policy, and who better to look at these issues with this perspective of data and modeling. And Corinne, are you available? So would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Yes, you've said more or less what I would be saying. I feel that over my career as a transport economist, I've been interested at the interface of policy and economics. And whilst I'm not a modeler, I do value the outcome of models as a way of telling us what sorts of things we should be looking for. So I'm looking forward to both of these presentations and hopefully be able to bring you some comments as a result of hearing them.
Wonderful. Well, perhaps we could come back to you, Joe, and to start your presentation. Great, yeah. So I think now it's presentation size. And Joe, you may have to unmute yourself. Joe, if you could unmute yourself, because I think the voice is not coming through yet. Hello?
Maybe the host can unmute him.
No, because we can
there it is.
mute
Okay.
people, but not. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Fine.
it
Joe,
work
perhaps
once...
go back to the first slide because we haven't actually got your voice through.
I will.
Great. Yeah, wonderful.
Okay, did it settle down now so you can see the full screen? Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Oh,
Joe.
okay, and the full screen shows?
Yes,
Good.
and that's all perfect now.
Fine, okay, so I want to say something about trying to link substantial accessibility improvements to the housing market dynamics that might result, which argue it might be an important consideration in trying to evaluate the way we're going to step into this sort of new world with significant changes in urban mobility. I'll say a little bit about research setting and the SimMobility microsimulation platform that we've been building and using, then try to focus on possibilities for developing car-light neighborhoods, tell a little bit about the modeling of housing market dynamics that we're including in this, focus on a Singapore example, and hopefully draw a few conclusions at the end. As I've said already, I'm in the MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and also involved in this Smart Center in Singapore, which is the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology that works together with other international universities like ETH and Axhausen on research in Singapore. I'm part of this Future Urban Mobility Interdisciplinary Research Group. The work I'll talk about today involves collaboration with a number of others. There's primarily a PhD researcher, Ronak Basu, who's actually on the call and will be available for some discussion in the informal session later on. The co-PIs, the Future Urban Mobility, include Chris Zegers and Moshe Ben-Akiva, who've been working with the SimMobility platform, and others also from MIT on the FM team. I've identified a few of the folks in the long-term research team here who've been involved as PhD researchers, postdocs, and collaborating faculty. The SimMobility microsimulation platform is one of these Muti models that has a long-term, mid-term, and short-term component as diagrammed on the right. We've heard a lot about these in various forms and will more during the session, so I won't dwell on it too much, but the long-term part provides a synthetic population that's passed to the midterm to simulate daily traffic patterns and passes performance measures back. Ours is activity-based and with a heavy integration between the behavioral submodels and the various components. For example, if you think of similability long-term, that's the module that generates the synthetic population, passes it to midterm, which then simulates the selection of a daily activity pattern, and then the within-day trip chains that fulfill that, and then pass that to the network simulation model with several feedback loops to make sure that people's expectations when they plan a day matches the performance that can be delivered if they were to carry out that plan. It's agent-based, and these are all discrete choice models that are nested to determine the daily activity schedule. Formulating in this way enables us to pass back accessibility measures in the form of log sums to the long-term model, which can then enable adjust expectations of the population and thereby enable them to make good housing mobility choices and employment and educational choices through our model of the market dynamics. What about developing car-light neighborhoods? Well, if we think of the traditional Muti example, then we might consider building a new highway or a transit line, and then using the Muti model to simulate travel patterns, travel times, land use change, etc., for 1 or 2 decades. In our case, we'd like to link the rollout of mobility and improvements to shorter-term choices about housing relocation and vehicle ownership. We want to focus on the initial years of a new initiative. For example, evaluating what happens if you try and make a neighborhood more car light as a result of services you provide or the urban design. So we'd like to do this with some what-if capability to compare the neighborhood change that results with or without various enhanced mobility services. Why focus on daily housing market dynamics? Well, we could use CGE models. We've heard a good bit about them over the years in AUM, and CGE models show forces that lead to long-run equilibrium. That can be quite useful in understanding which way the market is pushing, but they don't simulate the possible paths along the way. Muti models typically try and simulate the dynamics associated with multiple decades, but many rules and practices can change along the way. Do we know how things are going to get started? If you think about it, these new mobility technologies are going to be first tested in pilot projects. So will a particular car-light neighborhood, after some investment and attention from some government and private programs, be effective, expensive, attractive? To whom? We argue that the household relocation needs attention. The housing market's reasonably open, even places like Singapore, and can respond to changes much faster than redevelopment and land use change that takes time, money, and effort. So the initial experience might constrain implementation paths. Just look at what's happened with the roller coaster ride of dockless bikes and e-scooters to look at cases where adverse early experience can lead to constraining policy and regulation. So what's our approach to trying to use a Muti type model to simulate what might happen with a rollout of some of these new mobilities? Well, we have to figure out how we model buyer-seller response to the new mobilities. We got to convert the mobility improvements and services into accessibility benefits. And we have to focus on housing market as sort of household housing scale if we want to figure out what in fact is going to happen shorter term. So what we try and do is consider the daily searching, pricing, and bidding behavior along with reconsideration of vehicle holdings, so that we can simulate a pilot project rollout in a sort of study year, and we can simulate daily housing market dynamics of the buyer-seller interaction. We'd like to explore which kinds of study areas work best, what neighborhood, what rules, what side effects. We want to start with plausible accessibility adjustments that we postulate in our behavioral models, and then later on simulate the effects for specific places and mobility technologies using the midterm and short-term model to estimate what the result is of deploying particular services. So how do we model the housing dynamics? Well, we've try and build up a measure of demand and supply every day, and then have a bid auction model that actually uses some ideas from Francisco Martinez, who spoke a week or so here, one of his PhD students, regarding how to formulate and carry out the bid auction model. So on the supply side, we have available units that are vacant and for sale on that particular day, plus any new units or redeveloped units that might come out of the developer model. That constitutes supply. And these sellers set an asking price based on our hedonic submodel that includes an accessibility measure that comes from the midterm. On the supply side, among all our million households or so in the case of Singapore, we have a series of models that determine, first of all, who is awakened on any particular day based on moving rates and alerts. Then we estimate the affordability of what housing could that household afford. What are any eligibility rules that determined whether it's restricted to make certain moves or whether it can get subsidies. And we have a screening model that can target the likelihood of their being interested in a particular house based on its zone and housing type. And with all this, we construct a choice set based on the screening model and eligibility in order to build a choice set of 30 units that a particular household will focus on for a day of searching, and that constitutes the demand. Then we have the bid auction model that then looks at the way in which demand and supply try and reconcile on a particular day. And in this case, the bid that a household makes for a unit will be the result of, first of all, evaluating the willingness to pay for each unit in its choice set, estimating what price would have to be bid in order to win the bid, and then subtracting the willingness to pay from the price to get the consumer surplus, and the household will bid on the housing unit that maximizes expected consumer surplus if it's expected to be better than the current unit that they're living in. Households that win a bid will, at some time in the future, move into the unit and evaluate job, school choice, vehicle ownership, and the like. In Singapore, a number of households involve taxi driving, so we have that here as well. And they'll reassess vehicle jobs in school. Okay, so what's the simulation? Well, we need to figure out how we measure accessibility improvements that we want to simulate. So we begin with the 2012 calibration of simability for Singapore, which results from our synthetic population interacted with the transport models to translate the mobility into particular accessibility measures. And then we think about what changes might happen behaviorally. It could be that we just have increased buyer awareness, and it's more likely that they'll put a unit in the study area into their choice set because of all the advertising about the program. It could be that they actually value the increased accessibility, and we could consider that in the willingness to pay model that has an accessibility measure which we could adjust. Likewise, on the seller side, they could adjust the asking price based on the hedonic price model that also includes a measure of contribution to perceived value in the market that the sellers anticipate in the market price as a result of accessibility associated with a particular unit. And we could have increased buyer valuation of being vehicle free in our vehicle ownership model if they chose to live in the study area with the improved accessibility. Then we can run the market simulation for a year or more and ask questions about, does the study area become more vehicle free? Who moves in and out of the study area? And how sensitive are results to accessibility improvements? How sensitive to the characteristics of the study area. So let's look at a Singapore example. Singapore, we've got a Google map here of Singapore, and it's about 725 square miles with 5.7 million persons currently. We got the central area in the south, the airport, the central reserve with sort of wetlands and forests, and the industrial region in the west, including Jurong Island with Shell's largest oil refinery in the world. Here's a schematic of Singapore divided up into planning areas, of which about 3 dozen are populated, and this is a population density map of Singapore. In this case, we've highlighted 3 study areas that we'll choose to simulate, each of which has 4 to 7% of all the housing. So how do we calibrate this model? Well, we used data sources to generate a 2012 synthetic population, and then run the model calibration process with MT and ST. The source of the data were primarily travel surveys. They have a so-called HIT survey in 2008, 12, 16, with through the Land Transport Authority, a variety of census and employment data from SingStat, the Ministry of Manpower and the like, built environment data about building footprints and all from SLA, the Singapore Land Authority, and the Urban Redevelopment Authority, and the real estate transactions over the last few decades for the private sector, the Realis database, as well as public housing, which is the Housing Development Board provided. What's the resolution? Well, we simulate 1.15 million resident households. These are households whose head is a citizen or a permanent resident. Among those households, 81% live in public housing, which is quite common in Singapore. And they represent 4 or so million out of the 5 million individuals that lived in Singapore as of 2012. And overall, we distinguished sort of 6 planning regions, 55 planning areas, 1,169 traffic analysis zones. And actually, the finest grained spatial detail is the postcodes, of which there are 116,000. Most of the data we have is tagged for residence, employment, and trips at the postcode level. If you think about performance, the LT model can run a year on an 8-threaded sort of Windows desktop in about 45 minutes. If we run it on higher performance machines with 96 threads, it'll take about 75 minutes for 5 years of simulation. The integration with MT and to get equilibrium accessibility takes much longer, but a particular year of simulations of the kind we see here, this is the performance. So what are our assumptions? Well, in terms of accessibility improvement, then for housing evaluation, we'll make some assumptions about how much will a log sum accessibility measure increase, and we'll measure that in terms of some fraction of the standard deviation in accessibility measure across Singapore. In the case of vehicle ownership, with our vehicle ownership model, we'll look at the gap between if you own a car or don't own a car, and we'll assume that that shortens if you use the new mobilities to improve the no car option. And then we'll distinguish 3 scenarios. Scenario 1 is awareness only. All you do is increase the likelihood of having a study area unit in a choice set. Whereas scenario 2 increases willingness to pay, says the buyer values the added accessibility. Scenario 3 have both the buyer and the seller value it. And then all study areas reevaluate their ownership, vehicle ownership during the simulated year, study area residents, but it's only movers that otherwise evaluate their holdings when they move. So let's look at some results. So we look at this one, we've got 2 charts for the full study area population and for the non-movers. On the x-axis is how much we've increased the accessibility measure, the quarter, half, 100% of the standard deviation. And on the vertical axis, we measured the change in vehicle-free market share. That's how many households don't own a vehicle. So the baseline, no effect. We get for Topayo a slight increase in the number of people who own cars, so the car-free measure drops slightly. On the other hand, when we implement the program, then we can close the car-free gap, and a number of people will forego a vehicle, as evidenced by the increase, depending on how much increase in the car-free percentage, depending upon how much accessibility increases. And the main effect comes from non-movers in the study area over this 1 year who choose to forego their car. But we also see that the market behavior diminishes the net impact. So here's an example here where the change in car-free that was observed when it was only an awareness issue that made it more likely to have a housing unit in the study area in the choice set, and you started having buyers and sellers evaluate it. So when buyer-seller evaluations respond, the car-free effect drops. Why? Well, it's basically a gentrification effect. Here, what we plot is the same change in accessibility increase, how much we assume an improvement. And on the vertical axis, we plot the change in median household income. So we see in this case that if we look at the k equals 1/2 measure as to how much accessibility increases, that the in-movers have much higher incomes than the out-movers. So higher income households are also much more likely to own a car. And the gap grows non-linearly with accessibility change. Which neighborhood characteristics matter and how much? So in this case, we take 3 different planning areas in Singapore that have different measures of vacancy rate and car-free percentage that were estimated at the beginning of the simulation. And then we simulate the same things that we looked at in the last 2 slides. We can see that the market effects can reduce the car-free gain by almost 50%. In this case, in Pasir Ris and Punggol Sengkang in particular. So mere mobility improvements aren't enough. We have to pay attention to the composition of the housing inventory. So that's a quick run through a particular example. Let's go through a few observations regarding this. What about the recipe for car-light neighborhoods? Well, we need to worry about mobility plus housing policies, and the accessibility improvements can induce gentrification, which reduces car-light gains. We have another paper besides the one I listed in the abstract, TRD recently, that does a systematic comparison of combinations of vacancy and vehicle-free rates in these study areas. Also, we can simulate specific pilots, putting together Simability LT, MT, and ST, and other FM projects have explored specific Singapore projects using all 3 modules. In fact, we collaborated with ETH and Axhausen and others in doing some of these projects over the last couple of years. So the idea here is if you add particular fleets of, say, autonomous mobility on demand vehicles with realistic size and price, with or without private car restriction, what happens? What about ongoing research? Well, one thing we're doing to follow up what I talked about a little earlier is to try and test the effectiveness of housing market interventions. We can imagine increasing housing supply within the study area and by adding, in general, or by adding housing that's attractive to the households most likely to become vehicle-free. And we could provide these at a mix of affordable and market rates to see what kind of attention to the housing market can get the benefit of people foregoing their vehicles without being diminished as a result of too much of a gentrification effect. The preliminary results suggest that simply increasing supply doesn't work. It moves further away from the intended outcomes because the higher income households can still outbid. Instead, you need to provide targeted housing, possibly with subsidies, to be effective. What about some comments regarding the relevance of Muti modeling? Well, realistic modeling of the initial years of technology adoption, I think, are going to be particularly important for some of these new technologies we're talking about, where it isn't a mainline railroad that's going to stay there for the next 50 or 100 years. It's adding a few technologies that can come and go, and people can react rather quickly regarding whether they adopt it and whether they choose to relocate. So for some policy's early experience is crucial to acceptance, especially important when behavior can change quickly, long before land use change. And in particular, we think there's some value in exploring real estate market dynamics at sort of daily to yearly scale, where several types of behavioral changes are possible, and the trends can begin to be visible short term. Now, agent-based Muti modeling facilitates this kind of relevant programming, but still is computationally intensive, and that becomes an issue. I'd also like to suggest there's a need for synthetic population development and maintenance. It's often overlooked, it's private, it's unreproducible, it's not sufficiently heterogeneous. And there's the importance of open data, tools, and sandboxes with appropriate privacy protections and benchmark data sets so that it would be easier to add to, build, and test the kinds of tools that can take advantage of what computing technology enables us to do today. And I reference here a paper, Virtual City Construction and Use, that's coming out shortly in JTLU. Thanks, I'll stop here and list myself and the primary PhD research assistant, Ronak Basu, and acknowledge National Research Foundation in Singapore and the group that we've worked with and the agencies in Singapore whose contributions we appreciate in going through this, even though the conclusions are our own and not to be attributed to them. Okay, thank you, and we look forward to any discussion that we have now or later on this morning.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. And this may be a good point actually to pause for any clarification questions, if there are any that is coming. Or Corinne, do you have any thoughts at this stage yet?
Yes, I do have some thoughts. I don't know, do you want to take the two papers separately? Shall I address comments to Joe now and then to Kai later?
Well, it's very free form, so either way we'll do. Which do you think will work better?
I think it'll work better now if I can ask Joe some questions if he doesn't mind.
Sure.
Because I think it's really interesting the way that the Muti model, particularly for the non-transport people amongst the audience, is being used in a non-standard way to look at car-free or car-light neighborhoods. And particularly, as Joe says, because of the way Muti models can tell us something about the way in which the path from beginning to end actually pans out. So I think this raises a number of questions for me, which being the discussant, I have the opportunity to put the first few questions. So can I ask you, Joe? I've done quite a lot of work on looking at land value uplift and using that uplift as a way of funding new transport infrastructure. Now, the way that you've been describing the car light areas is clearly not costless. Could you, in a similar way to funding transport infrastructure, use the accessibility improvements to estimate increases in land value and therefore use land value uplift policies to help fund the car light area development? Is that something which the Muti model could help policymakers with?
Yes, I think so. I mean, this has been done in various cases. Now there's lots of sort of controversy and difficulty in getting land value uplift, land increment financing, or however you call it there, to let the land development process that adds value to tap into that as for some of the sources of funding for the improvements that you need. And there are classics in Hong Kong, for example, when they built the subway system, then they allowed the entity that constructed the subway to capture the land value increment associated with developing around stations. And and that proved to be quite useful because it accelerates the financing of the infrastructure projects and it pays for itself without additional taxes. Now, in other places in Atlanta, in the US, Atlanta, Georgia, then before transit-oriented development was popular, there were actually rules to prevent the infrastructure development agency that built a subway to have a financial interest in the development around the stations because there was too much corruption going on. So how you implement the land value taxing then has had a long history of controversy, but it certainly is the case here. It's also the case that when people's expectations change, when they believe that the accessibility is going to be improved, can affect when values change and who owns the property. Now, I think in this case, compared to big infrastructure investments, then these services can come and go and they aren't necessarily permanent. So I think the land values are not going to respond after the announcement of the project, but before it actually happens, compared to what happens when you announce new subway stations and all, and the land value moves right away. So I think it certainly is possible. Exactly how you do it and when you do it is sort of a very complicated question. To the extent that we can trust that any of these Muti models can illuminate the forces at work and the timing, then I think they can be helpful in doing a variety of what-if analyses.
Yes, I mean, that's very interesting because one of the big catches for actually using land value uplift is not knowing how much the uplift is going to be before you start. So if the modelling can actually show you the path by which the accessibility leads to the value uplift, then I think that is resolving one of the up to now difficult questions. A second question that I had, and then I think we might go to other people to ask questions of you, is how important is the structure of the housing market to how the Muti model behaves? Because my understanding of the Singapore housing market is not that detailed, but I think it's rather unusual compared to other countries. Is that right?
It certainly is unusual. In particular, 80-some% of the citizens and permanent residents live in HDB housing, and yet have a high fraction of home ownership in Singapore. The government builds the housing. Now, there's a whole history of issues with respect to Singapore housing. Basically, they build the housing, they sell it to targeted audiences. There's eligibility and affordability issues at cost, essentially, the carefully constructed cost. And then the land value appreciation goes to the homeowner, and that's one way in which over the last 50 years of development in Singapore, they've enabled the population to buy into the land value gains that have occurred as Singapore has developed. Now, in terms of using targeted policies with respect to housing to complement the introduction of new technologies, then Singapore is in great shape because they control when and where they build the new public housing. And they've used that as a development strategy for the last several decades. Doesn't mean it can't be done other than that, because all over the world, metropolitan areas regulate their housing market through zoning as well as other tax financing strategies of various kinds. So it's still possible, but in a place like Singapore, there's all the more possibility for the government to coordinate its actions since it's so heavily involved in the housing market. Thing I'd point out that I tried to emphasize here is that even though it's still, if you're going to build new housing, it takes a long time to build. You got to be careful when you introduce these with these pilot projects, because people can choose to move to another house quickly, and the market prices are going to go up and down in response. So even though in general building new housing takes a long time, people can shuffle where they live and work fairly short notice, and that could significantly affect the early years of a rollout of some new program that has great promise, but may have side effects.
If I may ask, I think, as you said, Joe, the Singapore government manipulates the housing market to a large extent. So how much and how did you calibrate the awareness set of the buyers? Because from our own work, we do know that this is really tricky with lots of rules, lots of extra considerations, lots of strategies which the Singaporeans adopt in the game for housing. So how much work did you put in this element of it?
Well, what we're basically simulating is the resale market. And we actually, I didn't talk about it here, but Singapore puts out new public housing. They're still growing, and in a typical year, they might have 15 to 20-some thousand, 20-some thousand, if it's an election year, of public housing added to the inventory. And that's significant on a market that typically sells less than 100,000 units per year. So in our model, we can stipulate the time of sale and the time of occupancy of new units that the government adds. And when we run what we call non-equilibrium runs, we actually try and simulate the actual unfolding of public programs. So we can do that. And for example, that new research that I mentioned where we're saying, suppose you flood the market, can you forestall the gentrification effect? That's easy to do in the model because we have tables that say, when is a project first offered for sale and when is it available for occupancy? And in Singapore, you can buy a unit 3 years before it's finished. So we have done that. For the behavior, in the awareness case, we're saying people don't value it. And you could say people aren't going to value accessibility until they see it on the ground. But you can advertise it, and HDB does when they have new rollouts, including some for car light, although they don't have the new technologies. So then we just double the likelihood that a particular unit would be chosen to be put in a person's choice set. So that's how we deal with awareness. And then otherwise, we look at postulated changes in accessibility in the valuation of willingness to pay for households and the market price that the sellers use to set an asking price. Then the next step, which on our collaboration we've done a little bit of, is NT can simulate particular new technology. So you can say, I'm going to run a fleet service, and because it's automated, it's going to cost half as much as taxis. And you can run simulations to see how much fleet size do you need to meet a certain level of performance. And you can actually try and deliver the service and then get accessibility measures, which we can use to say, well, if this is what the perceived is, this is what the actual accessibility is, and it's treated like accessibility is today, then we can make some simulations.
Okay.
I just wondered whether Joe, your colleague, Runette Basu, would like to perhaps say something at this stage?
Sure, I believe he's on the call, and I warned him that that might happen. So if you can add folks who can talk in the webinar section, he can. And in any event, he's going to join us for the informal discussion later. You're muted, Ying.
Been muted. Yes, and Corinne, there's also a question from Professor Michael Wegener in the Q&A, which is, how would the new urban world in Singapore look like? So maybe this is quite a nice point actually to imagine that given all the insights that the model has already brought, so the wider impressions of how the urban transformation is going to go in this way, and how this could be triggered in the next few decades.
If we get into that too much, Kai will never have a chance to talk today, because that's so. Look, Singapore was one of the first places to invest in congestion pricing. They're in the midst of changing from gantries at the entrance to downtown into road usage pricing. Every vehicle that operates in Singapore has the technology in it that can both do GPS tracing and thereby do road pricing based on where and when you drive. With respect to these new mobilities, they've funded this project over the last decade to get a head start on looking at what's going to happen with automated vehicles of various kinds. And so I think they've certainly put their research money where their mouth is regarding trying to anticipate what's going to happen. Now, the autonomous vehicle stuff is still overhyped. People think it's going to come sooner than it is. Would you buy a vehicle that only drives 90% of the time because when it rains hard or in the morning and dusk, et cetera? So we still have a long way to go with that. On the other hand, there are billions of cars in the world. There are many niche markets for using these technologies in various forms. And a place like Singapore is investing in figuring that out. So they charge more than $5,000 or $6,000 a year to put a car in the road as a tax. That gives them a few $1 billion, little old Singapore. And then they use that to invest in road infrastructure. So they have been investing in public transit, subways, as well as highways. And they're investing in electric fleets and charging stations, et cetera. And they're likely to prohibit owning autonomous vehicles individually, as opposed to subscribing to fleet services that provide it more as a mobility on demand service. And the equivalent of Uber, which isn't there now, Grab and all, as well as the traditional taxi companies, are highly used in the city. So they still have an opportunity, I think, and are well on their way to playing a leadership role in adapting to these new mobile technologies. But there isn't any one size fits all for how they're going to roll it out, let alone how the rest of the world is going to roll it out.
So would you be your hunch that if there are going to be any hybrid kind of public transport designs and solutions, it might actually start to emerge there first, given that the government planning departments are getting involved in all the design and planning of
yes, it isn't just right. It isn't just there. For example, in a typical place like the States, strategies for fleets of autonomous vehicles that then can be higher utilized and not deal with quite the congestion problem in the city, much more likely. But in the suburbs, those are not going to be cost effective because the density isn't there. So what are you going to do in these big metro areas where autonomous vehicles managed as fleets are not going to be viable options in the periphery, and they are in the city? Singapore doesn't really have that problem. So they aren't going to set the tone for what everybody's going to do. But they certainly are going to be there regarding a set of strategies and policies that might work there and a willingness to do experimentation with it. But there's certainly not going to be one size fits all. And Kai, we may want to wait to talk about this later on, because I'm sure Kai has lots of thoughts about what's going to happen in this area, as well as given a number of talks on that.
Absolutely. I can see that the post-session the chats actually could also be very lively, and I hope colleagues actually could join there as well, actually, for this wider discussion. So thank you so much, Joe. Maybe this is a good point to move on to Professor Kai Axhausen's presentation, and then we could come back for more questions. Perhaps Corinne could then play the discussant now as well.
Thank you. Great to be back at AUM.
Thank you really very much for an inspiring talk on this topic. So Kai, perhaps we could hand the floor to you.
Thank you very much.
We look forward to it.
For having invited me, and I'll try to talk about something slightly different, but let me just share my screen. Okay. What I offered and what I can talk about is the pandemic, but the pandemic obviously then has long-term impacts on urban form, one assumes. Now, what can I show you? What I show you is the results of a study we have been undertaking together with colleagues from the University of Basel and local team. And we have essentially conducted a GPS-based tracking study for now over a year. And that gives us a unique data set to track the impacts of COVID on human behavior. Now, as we all know, COVID isn't the first pandemic, but it's kind of the first pandemic which hit our consciousness in this way. When you look at these numbers, these are the excess death in Switzerland, above and beyond the expected numbers. And the years before were your typical influenza wave. Nothing unusual. Everybody knows these happen and nobody gets really excited about it. But this year, the peak, which was then stopped hard through the lockdown, was getting our attention because the disease was new. The disease was more deadly than the influenza, and it was worldwide. Now, not only did the disease go up in the spring, but after the spring peak, these are the Swiss numbers. The blue line is cases, the little yellow dots are people in hospital, and the red dots are the fatal cases. You can see that after the peak in the spring, Switzerland adopting the lockdown measures, just like everybody else that did, a bit more relaxed to a certain extent, numbers went down and the fatalities went to nearly zero in mid-May. And then I think Switzerland, like everybody else in Europe, enjoyed the summer. But that didn't stop the disease from continuing to spread. And you can see that the fatalities didn't increase, didn't respond as quickly and as rapidly as in the spring. And I think that lulled all of us into complacency. Because when the numbers started to shoot up again in September, October, in a way it was too late because the disease had spread, contact tracing was starting to falter, there were organizational difficulties here as well, and now the disease is more or less out of control, although a second, not lockdown, but a second set of strong restrictions have been brought in 2 weeks ago. And we are now looking forward to finding out what will happen. Now, the question is, how does all of that impact travel behavior? Now, I said that we are doing this since September of last year. So we must have been doing something different because we couldn't anticipate that the pandemic would strike us in February. So what were we doing? We were doing a study called MOBIS, which was focused on the implementation of a virtual road pricing and information study. And we collected and recruited a very large sample, which we kitted out with a GPS-based app on their smartphones, both iOS as well as Android. And you can see that in the fall of last year, you see that there's a downward trend in addition to whatever the treatment effects are. And the study ended then more or less in January. And as typical, males are traveling more than females. What happened was that not everybody switched off the app. And we didn't ask them to. Running the app is kind of not costing much. So I said, oh, let's collect some more data. But what happened then, as we went into February, and as became clear that the pandemic was coming to us, and clearly after it had arrived in Italy, had arrived elsewhere, we said, we have to use this tool to help us understand how people change. This is a unique opportunity. We'll hopefully not have it again. So the sample was drawn of a mixture of official and private sources. And we recruited in total 3,700 participants for the MOBIS, for the study in the fall of last year. And about 1,100, 1,200 responded to our invitation to reinstall or continue to track. Now, in the first phase in MOBIS, we were able to offer them 100 francs incentive to participate for 8 weeks of tracking. Those in the pricing element could earn a bit more money by changing behavior. We couldn't do that in the COVID phase. We didn't have that money lying around. So these are pure volunteers, and we are extremely grateful for their willingness to participate. The app is called Catch a Day, which is a rebadging of the app by Motion Tag, a well-known firm in this business based in Berlin. So here you can see the development of the sample over the month. You can see how it shoots up in March. This is when we invited them. And a large number of people registered, said they are willing. People who tracked was lower, and the people who are mobile are lower still. And you can see by the difference between the blue line and the black line that in the lockdown period, which is the first period between those dashed lines, lots and lots of people stayed at home. And this share went down as we went along, and it hasn't really increased yet after the second lockdown. So case numbers are actually higher here than they were there. So it's an interesting question. What did the first wave do in comparison to the second wave, which is just as vigorous as the first wave? Now, we can look at a couple of aspects of that behavior. And one is obviously the share of people going out of home. I think that's the first question I always ask when I look at travel survey data, to find out how proper the study has been run. Because in the before period, you can see that 85% of people went out. Now, this is even low because normally I expect to see about 95% of people having left home on a day. You can see that this was already dropping before the lockdown. It went down to 62% and has since crept up and continued, but it stayed much, much lower than it should be. So there are still lots of people who use the opportunity, work from home, stay at home in this period. And you can see no major trends here. There are particular bad weekends, which kind of lower the willingness of people to move out. Now, from a transport perspective, we are worried about congestion. That means we're worried about passenger kilometers traveled, the number of activities, and then how far they travel, activity space, distances. As I said before, males travel more than females, and that remained true during the COVID period. But you can see that the drop-off started before the lockdown and then slowly recovered. And since there was this mask requirement, which came in late in Switzerland, in particular for public transport, it has more or less stayed stable. But you can see that there's a slight drop-off in the run-up to the second lockdown. But since the second lockdown, not much change again. People are already pre-adjusting their patterns and sticking with them. Now, what is interesting also in the longer run is how does the various changes in employment situation impact travel? There are two things which has happened. One is that people were allowed to, got continuing payment, but didn't have to show up at work, which is called Kurzarbeit. In German, it's a furlough in England. And you can see here that those who didn't have that privilege, so they had to continue to work, travel less than the people on unpaid work. So essentially, these people made use of their new freedom, their new extra time they had at their disposal after the shock of the lockdown had worn off to travel more leisure, other things which people do and maybe had bottled up and now came to the fore. And this has been maintained through most of the lockdown period. And now it's disappearing again into the second lockdown. The other thing, which has always been the great white hope of transport planning, is working from home will solve our problems. And our results show that the experiences made in California in the 70s still hold true. What do we see? We see that the people working from home and only working from home are traveling less than the people who have to go to work. No surprise. But the difference becomes smaller over time, and it disappeared completely in the relaxed summer month. And it isn't showing up yet again in the second lockdown. So the people working from home have the opportunity to travel at other times for other purposes, and they make use of it. So working from home will not solve congestion problems unless it's carefully coordinated to make sure that those who travel at different times of day on different days. What happened to the trips and to the size of the activity spaces? The number of trips we observe with the GPS tracking in the before period, this is the baseline, which was September, October of 19, was slightly above 4. And that's a number one should remember. If you see a travel diary returning to you a number like 2.5 or 3, you know that people have refused to answer your questions. You can see that there was an enormous drop after the lockdown. It recovered relatively quickly. And since June, the amount of trips is more or less where it was in the September of last year. We will see what will happen as November drags on and the second lockdown drags on, or the second restricted period drags on. But I would guess people must have changed their attitudes towards the disease, which we see here, and the risk perception of it. Now, in terms of activity space is a summary measure of the spread and distribution of the destinations. And we capture it by calculating a two-dimensional confidence interval called the confidence ellipse, centered in home. And you can see that this area drops drastically, nearly 80%. So people really stayed close to home. But again, it recovered. And by midsummer, it was there where it had been before. And it's now going down. But we have to remember it's also becoming fall. So people might not travel as much. So we have to compare that formally against what happened last fall. And we haven't done that yet. Some of it is the fear of the disease. The other one is just fall and nothing, all the exciting and nice places not becoming less attractive as the fall continues. Now, next to all these kilometers traveled and the distances, the question is, how do they travel? What modes are they using? We used this tertiary graph to allow us to compare different groups in the population. And I think in many ways, the most interesting one is the dark blue one. How are they defined? They have an annual season ticket for public transport, which in Switzerland means that you can take any public transport which is running around, just jump on and you're safe. Okay, there's some exclusions for the very expensive mountain railways, but generally speaking, you can travel on anything. The circle gives you the market share in the before period. So they were traveling 65% of their kilometers by public transport. They were traveling about 30% with cars and about 4 or 5% by slow modes. After the lockdown, this crashed to only about 20% by public transport, 60% by cars, but also 10 or more than 10% by slow modes, walking and cycling. And then since then, it went slowly up, but it hasn't recovered. And this is an obvious worry of the public transport providers, in particular the railroad, that what happens when these people realize that they're not traveling as much? Is it worth to pay for an annual season ticket? And you have similar trends for other groups, which are defined by various other forms of public transport season tickets and car ownership. Now, when I started to think about it, it was clear that the unwillingness to return to the train might generate problems on the road system, because the capacity wasn't miraculously expanded in the summer. So what would happen if everybody would return to drive by car? And the most obvious thing to do is to look at the development of the speeds people show in our GPS tracks. So what did we do? We calculated door-to-door speeds of our sample for different distance bands. And you can clearly see that the lockdown period, which is the dashed line, was marvelous, in particular for car drivers. It was as fast as it never had been before. Clearly, if 60% of the competition goes away. Now, the speed of the before period, the black line, was reached pretty quickly already after in the relaxation period. And the yellow line, which is currently, you can see that we are where we were before the study happened. Now remember that we have still an unusual large chunk of the population which doesn't leave the house. So they are not on the road, they are not on the streets, and they are not taking up capacity. So what is happening here? Now, what we did see is some change in the mode choice. And I've shown you some of it already, but let's have a look at this because it's a bit more detailed. What you can see that the large vehicles, trains and trams and buses, have shown massive losses in usage. So this was nearly 80% loss. So people just not using the big vehicles. It recovered to some extent, but for the railways, we are still talking about 40 to 50% less people, less mileage with trains and trams. The buses were a bit better, but now the second wave seems to have turned people away again from the buses. Now, walking and the car recovered much more quickly, and it's there where it was before. But remember, there's still 10% of people who are not traveling at all. Now, the unusual winner, but in a way, in retrospect, to be expected winner was the bicycle. The famous bicycle boom, which everybody's talking about, became visible in our data. And I have to say that there is a second ongoing panel in Switzerland, and it doesn't show this boom as much as we do. Now, different messages, because there are traffic counters for cycles which show on certain locations no boom, it shows a boom in other locations. Anyway, from a low base, cycling kind of gained another 200%, obviously with weather dips, and that was maintained through much of the summer, 140, 150%. But towards the fall, it went down, and now cycling is kind of back. There's a gain, 20% gain is substantial. I think when you think about how much it would take you policy-wise to achieve that. But it's still nothing like the gains of the spring and summer. So we'll have to watch what will happen as we go on. Okay, so COVID drastically changed our travel behavior. It kept people at home. It reduced the activity spaces. It reduced the speeds, is likely to reduce the speeds. So we have to ask ourselves, will this be a signal allowing us, forcing us to change the trajectory of transport policy? Now, one thing which we have to remember is that transport policy has a basic dilemma. And the basic dilemma is that we believe and we know that accessibility increases the productivity of our societies. It does so on the economic side, and it does so also on the private side. And based on that hunch and our knowledge, societies have invested in accessibility for the last 250 years, now nearly 300 years. And we do know that this gain in productivity can be translated in gains in social welfare. Now, this is obviously a big issue because we all know that different societies have seen median income stagnate, others have been able to increase the median incomes. So this is a big policy question, but overall, the money would be there. Now, this is the positive side, which everybody wants. On the other hand, we do know that this increase in social welfare, simplest measure is obviously the average wages available, becomes a tool to buy more cars. And clearly, if the accessibility is focused on improving car accessibility. And that in turn reduces the willingness to use public transport, because public transport just by system design is slower than the car. The second downside is, as we increase accessibility, we invite people to travel more, VMT. And given current fleet technology, this produces more CO2. And we all know that CO2 emissions have to be restricted very quickly and very radically. So what do? Do we still continue to invest in accessibility or not? And the third dilemma is accessibility invites sprawl. Quite easily, if you make travel easier and the households take some of their money into buying larger apartments and larger houses, they will sprawl. Again, that encourages VMT and CO2 emissions, never mind all the gray energy embedded in the too large, too far away houses. Now, it's in this context that transport policy really hasn't found a solution to balance all of these objectives. Some countries are continuing with improving car accessibilities, inviting CO2 emissions, inviting sprawl. There are some which are building more public transport, but public transport is also inviting sprawl, just a bit more efficiently, but still. Now, in this policy environment, we have the COVID. Now, the pandemic has reminded us that concentration is potentially deadly. Now, there's a big discussion to what extent you can control the pandemic in a dense urban environment, but many households have decided that living away from people is a good idea. So the pandemic threat supports the sprawl, which is generally supported by transport policy anyway, which increases VMT again. Now, the pandemic threat also has brought in this great hope, working from home. Now, working from home will not reduce VMT, as I have shown, or not as much as we hope. And in particular, it isn't matched with relative policies to reorganize the time use and of the week. And I don't see any discussion of that yet. The pandemic threat encourages working from home, and it's not clear whether it will be able to maintain the productivity which we have enjoyed so far, because lots of households are not really ready in their internal organization of tasks to cope with it, either because the males just can't cope with doing homework, or because the flat or the house is just too small to cope with all the people there at being at the same time. So there is still a lot of adjustment which needs to happen. Now, if you combine sprawl with working from home, it's pretty clear to me that the commitment to transit use, which normally expresses itself in buying heavily discounted but still expensive season tickets, will go down. And with that, you have congestion because people still need to travel. And then finally, the sprawl will encourage and continue to support spatial equity, because as you sprawl out, people sort themselves into areas which have more people like themselves. And that brings up all the questions of social equity, which we are all aware of. And I think in the US is also then reinforced by racial and ethnic diverse or spreading out or ghettoization. So it's a real problem. Now we are transport planners, so we believe that the shock will work itself through the system and will have a new equilibrium. The question is whether we like the equilibrium, and that's why we have to do policy. Now, we have this still substantial share of people who seem to work from home and people who don't leave home. Now, is that a stable solution? In Switzerland, like everywhere else, people have started to discuss who is going to pay for the workplace at home. The extra printer, the better Wi-Fi, the better cable, the extra space. So firms will have to start negotiate with their employees who is paying for that cost. And then we have the issue whether that working from home will not invite a reorganization of industrial work by essentially inviting the companies to say, okay, if you're at home anyway, why don't we shift you to a freelancing, to a putting out system like at the very beginning of Industrial Revolution when weavers worked from their homes in England and elsewhere? Will we kind of go to a generalized gig economy as we go along? And do we want that? And then how resilient is such an economy? And again, the US is unfortunately the bad example of that, that if you tie healthcare to employment and you don't give it to freelancers, you have a massive problem in the pandemic case. Then what will happen to the large vehicles? We all know that to maintain a relatively high speed level in congested urban areas, we need to put people on large vehicles. It's just not going to work any other way, short of building an enormous amount of tunnels and new roads for which we don't have the money. So how do we make sure that these large pooled vehicles and the firms which run them don't go under? Then, on the other hand, the pandemic has shown that cycling is an option. And it's particularly the e-bike, which potentially could deliver a city which is just as fast as a city of cars, but using much less space. So how do we allocate the road space to the different users? The pedestrians, the cyclists, the e-bikes, the cars, and the big vehicles. Knowing that they influence each other and you can't have all of them in the same amounts and still expect the same speeds. There is essentially no research on that, and there's certainly no policy discussion, or only the very start of a policy discussion of how we do this allocation. Then we have to ask ourselves, at what speed do we want to travel? This is never made explicit, okay, short of Singapore, which has an explicit speed goal for its downtown area, or actually more or less it's the whole island. But it will become an issue, because if we allow everybody to drive around in a car, we'll essentially convert ourselves into Bangkoks and Jakartas, which not many cities want to become. So how do we do crowd pay for crowding on the vehicles, for all types of vehicles. Will there be road pricing like in London? Will it be like in Singapore? Will it be like in Milan? We don't know yet. There's obviously the old standby of parking pricing, which has to be considered jointly with crowding pricing. And then, which is a new issue for us, is how do we control crowds in cities? So far, if you look at a planning book, they will always have pictures of crowded plazas, of happy campers in the cafes. But in a pandemic, this is an issue. So how do we develop technologies and then rules of how many people we want to have in a certain bit of the city? This spring, many cities just closed certain areas down, didn't allow anybody in, but that can't be the long-term solution. And then on the reverse side, to kind of at least cope with some of the sprawl, is we have to think about how we price for the technical services on greenfield sites. Because certainly in Switzerland and Germany, these are subsidized by providing those services at average cost prices and not at marginal cost prices. So that's another issue which we'll have to look at. And with that, I invite you to look at these reports. We do a bi-weekly report of the COVID panel, and they are published on this address, and all the other work can be found at the other address. And with that, I'm looking forward to Corinne's and then everybody else's questions. We can't hear you. You're still muted.
I haven't said anything. I haven't said anything yet.
Yin was,
I was trying to say something. Corinne, over to you.
Okay, thank you. As you say, Kai, this is a unique data set effected from being in the right place at the right time, for which I don't think you necessarily need to be congratulated, but congratulated more for taking the opportunity as it presented itself. There's a number of things which I think are quite unique and quite insightful, and I don't know whether you have answers for them. Can I go through a list of questions? Yes, please, and you come?
Please.
I think it's interesting that there's a remarkably constant number of trips undertaken both inside and outside of lockdown, particularly in terms of the first lockdown. And particularly interesting that the people that were on furlough or Kurzarbeit actually travelled more than those people who weren't. The working from home experience that are showing up in the data that you've got there is similar to what we've seen in Sydney. And it's clear that working from home won't solve the congestion problem, because people with concerns, in some cases I think misplaced, about the spread of the pandemic are avoiding public transport and turning to their cars. And to a certain extent, that's making peak hour travel by car more likely to be on a congested road. I had lots of questions. I think...
Maybe I answered those so far, and then you can go back to the next one.
Okay, fine.
Good. I think on the trips, you do see a drop in the very first kind of lockdown period. Switzerland essentially closed all non-essential businesses, all restaurants, bars, all possibilities to engage in leisure, fitness studios and so on. And that led to a substantial drop. But still, it wasn't a drop to zero, because in Switzerland, you were allowed, obviously, to go shopping. You were allowed to go to the doctor and the pharmacy. People were encouraged, not encouraged, but nobody forbid you to go hiking and walking. And so perversely, those who survived are ending out of this pandemic probably fitter than before, because having nothing else to do, they just hiked and walked. But you can see that in May, that's after the official lockdown ended, the numbers went back to before. And I think it reflects just the personal needs of people. This is leisure, this is shopping, this is work. So yes, it went back to normal.
But I think one of the surprising things, for me at least, is that all the data shows that people do leap back almost to where they were before.
Yeah.
But the thing which hasn't recovered is public transport.
Yes.
And the question is, what can we learn from these figures that allow us to help go back to improving take-up of public transport, which of course has to be the bedrock of promoting sustainability in our cities? I
agree. I think we do see that there are still a fair number of people who work from home. And it's, I would claim, in particular, those people with long distances. And long distance commuting in Switzerland is by preference by train. Because on long distances, the train really becomes as fast as the car. So this is intimately tied to working from home question. And we'll see what happens when the firms start to recall people to the workplace. Now, this will then in turn depend on how much productivity we can as a society produce by mixing working from home with being in the office. And I think this is what everybody is trying. I'm pretty sure that all the academics among us are now thinking, okay, some of the PhD students or master students are at home. How do I support them? How do I supervise them? How do I provide input into what's happening? How do I make sure that the team we have doesn't kind of fall to pieces? And this very same happens in all the industrial firms and consultancies. And that will really be, I would argue, the main reason and the main thing which will drive the train in particular back up. And then there is the obvious question that people don't seem to trust the statements about how good the air conditioning systems are in the big vehicles. And if you're on a bus for 5 minutes, you say, okay, or 10 minutes, you say, oh, that's okay. But if you're on a tram for 20 minutes or on a train for an hour, you start to worry, or enough people start to worry. And this is obviously a big issue for public transport undertakings. How can they improve their technology enough so that the risk of sitting on a train for 2 hours doesn't feel like exposing yourself too much?
Well, that's also a question of perception, isn't it, too? It's not only dealing with the technology side of it, it's actually getting into people's consciousness that it's safe.
Yeah, but the point is that it's just like telling your boy that spinach is good for him. It's true, but he still doesn't like it. Now, I think the public transport undertakings have to do something and have to be seen to do something. It's probably not good enough to say, oh, we looked at all the cases and yes, so only that many really have picked up the virus on the train. I think to gain back a large chunk of this business, they will have to invest into some technologies to clearly make a safety improvement.
Yes, I think my point is that in itself won't be enough.
No, but I think it's required. I think if you just do ads saying, okay, of the whatever 5,000 people cases of COVID today, only 50 caught it on the bus. I'm not sure that will win the day.
No. Can I just change tack? And this is my last question before I can see that there's one on the Q&A as well.
Yep.
What worries me in terms of city sustainability and city longevity in lots of ways is that working from home means there's going to be less people at work. And we know that cities grow partly because of the agglomeration economies, which are generated by bringing together people of similar skills to develop the agglomeration. How are we going to maintain the development of agglomeration economies in the face of working from home?
I think this is a very good point. It will depend on a mixture of modes of contact. When you look at the classical New York or London neighborhood, this is maybe, what is it, 500 meters or 250 meters in diameter. So very, very small. And most of the movements can be done walking. But this is not really bringing the intellectual and experience together which you need for these agglomeration economies and knowledge spillovers you want. So I think we will have to think, how can we produce these knowledge spillovers in the absence of people working in the same workplace? And I have no clue how we're going to do that. But I think that will be one of the things we have to think about to allow us to continue to make the productivity gains we need as a society, in particular in Western Europe, where all of the baby boomers have to be paid during retirement. And we can only do that by making sure that the 30 and 40-year-olds today are massively more productive than we are today.
Yes, because of course working from home, I think, works well at the moment because we know the people that we're working with. When you get to the point where you have new starters, it becomes that much more problematic in terms of lack of contact.
Absolutely.
There is a question from Michael Batty. I don't know, can you see the questions too, Kai, or do I need to read it out?
No, I think you better do, because I have to get out of here to actually look at the...
Okay, so it's quite a long question.
Yeah.
In London and the UK, some work we have done in looking at trip patterns of essential workers, as defined by government, are much the same everywhere as non-essential, with a national ratio of about 20% essential, where they have to go to work, and 80% where they don't, furlough, working from home. They vary enormously by region, and it looks as though more have remained at home in the south, the north and Scotland and Wales as the lockdown has proceeded. So this is the question now. I'm very interested in your work, which shows more people working at home have travelled more than those who are working at their place of work. I think that's what you said. Is that correct?
What you see, yes, the people who work outside home, they travel more in the lockdown period, but kind of from August, it's a wash. You can't really see a difference anymore. The people who mix travel in the middle, and the people working from home do travel less, but the difference is only about 20%, and it disappeared by July. So these people traveled less originally, but then said, oh yes, they found out that working from home gives them more freedom. And I think this is also the time it needs probably for everybody to find out that you can escape without your colleagues knowing. As long as you have your mobile phone with you, you can be anywhere. You can be somewhere on a nice mountain and enjoy it, and then take the phone call.
I won't ask if that's personal experience, Kai.
To some extent.
I can't get it. I can't find Michael to know whether that's answered his question, but no doubt he will. There's another question. He says, can he qualify this, Kai?
Yeah.
In central London, where he lives, the number of working from home is massive. 500,000 workers aren't in work in the square mile, which is the city. Yep. So this is an issue.
Yes, it is. It's an interesting question, what will happen to those neighborhoods? And this is really also a land use question. Maybe Joe has some idea. Because if all of those people who kind of disappeared during the day are now at home, that means that they are around to go shopping, to go to local bars, to local restaurants. So it's an interesting question whether that reallocation of purchasing power and human interest will change all of those neighborhoods. So, and how quickly. And we will see how quickly that happens. And I think clearly in a city like London, which already has quite a good infrastructure in kind of the close-in suburbs, kind of the Ealings and Chiswicks, it might not be really that much change, but for the outer suburbs, it might become a bigger change with all of those people normally in the city being there during lunchtime and thinking, oh my God, I can't stand another lunch at my table and have to go out.
But I think there's another issue there, Kai, as well, and that is particularly in Australian cities and American cities, where there's much more of a concentration of workplaces in CBDs, there's going to be an adjustment in terms of building values, those buildings which are primarily workplaces, and whether or not they can be used for alternative uses.
That's true, but we all know these buildings are built for, I don't know, what is it these days, a 30-year lifetime, and they will be remodeled. It's just that their loss of value happens earlier, and clearly that value loss then obviously kind of spreads out throughout the economy, because if those developers can't pay back their mortgages, that will have impacts on the banks, and that will have impacts on everybody else. All these people working in the city, in the service industry around it, their unemployment will take some time to recover till they find posts again in the suburbs where all those consultants and bankers then are. Yes, I think it's not going to be easy if we have this massive change, very short time period for the cities, in particular those which have overinvested in their CBDs like London and New York to some extent. Sydney, I don't know well enough.
There is another question.
Yes.
Oh, it's another add-on from Michael.
Yep.
To an extent, the square mile is 500,000 workers and 8,000 residents.
Yep.
So the concept of neighbourhood is tricky.
Yep.
Transport for London is running at 30% of usual all over London.
Yep. Yes, and I think this is similar to the numbers we are seeing, although it's worse. But I think for London, and I don't know what the situation in New York or the other truly underground systems are, is what I said earlier about air conditioning. The tube is no fun in the summer at the best of time, but now with COVID on top, I can fully understand that people say, no, thank you. And we do know, and clearly when we see in the Swiss numbers, it's particularly the trains which are non-used. And just like in England or New York, trains are modes to move high-earning, well-educated people to a large extent. And these are the people who are kind of by definition non-essential because they can work from home, and they are missing.
May I ask a question? This is a clarification question. I wonder if you have any idea of any existent seasonality of effects comparing to previous years, because the increase in bike use in the nice months of the year, or the increase in travel patterns for those who have started to work at home could just be linked to usual seasonality effects. And I also wonder whether you had a percentage of those who were already working from home before the beginning of the pandemic.
I think in terms of seasonality, we can now start to compare it, because the Mobis COVID study started in September. So now we can essentially do a full comparison of the same people on the seasonality front. Now, for the summer, for the spring, I did compare it with numbers of earlier national travel diaries and did see that the increase here was well above the usual seasonal growth in cycling and walking. So that was a true extra growth. But formal modeling is still outstanding, and that will be added as we are going along.
And is there a way to link these patterns to mode split for work travel choices?
Yes. Okay. What we are currently doing, we are essentially doing formal mode choice modeling with our data. In particular, we are interested to see to what extent some of the changes are due to the reduction in capacity, because the SBB, the Federal Railroads in Switzerland, took out quite a number of trains early during the lockdown and the COVID pandemic. And we haven't got final results, but we do see that people really didn't like to be on the train. So we saw increases in value of travel time savings by a factor of 3 for kind of the first month. It has gone down again, but the last numbers I've seen, I haven't seen the very latest results, we're still kind of at double the value of travel time savings, i.e. not wanting to be on the train in the last couple of weeks. So there has been a change in perception towards train travel, and this will be one of the reasons that the train companies will have to do something about it.
There's a couple more questions or statements that have come up, Kai.
Yep.
The first one is from Ronak Basu, who works with Joe,
yeah.
who says that the MBTA in Boston has stagnated at 70% below expected for the last couple of months now. I think that's more or less a statement.
Yes, I think it's interesting numbers. It's obviously worse than we see in Switzerland, but again, you probably have to look. I don't know Boston well enough to know how much of the travel is by these non-essential workers on the metro in Boston. To what extent it's traveled by essential workers.
And the other side of it is that, you know, you need to look at the mode share pre-pandemic as well.
I think it would be interesting to look at the Google numbers and the Apple numbers to see how that kind of divides up by destination, by trip purpose as well. Yeah. And Michael Wegner.
Yes, there's another one from Professor Wegner. The fascinating last slides of your presentation discuss what might happen if the pandemic continues permanently. But isn't it more realistic to assume that it will end in 2021?
No. I think it's quite clear that any vaccine will not give us 100% security in the sense of protecting us. It will be not hurting us, but it will not protect us. And it's quite clear that assuming that the allocation of the vaccine is rational, it will first go to the people working in the health system. It will then go to the high-risk groups. And then slowly, it will end up with persons like myself. Because overall, we are not really that much at risk in terms of our health status. So I think the pandemic will reoccur and will stay. And we don't know yet what else will be thrown at us. And it's a really interesting, there was one very interesting graph in the New York Times at the very beginning in April, where the New York Times showed the number of people killed in New York City with early 19th century pandemics, cholera, typhus, and the others. And they were obviously massively more deadly than COVID. But still, New York grew. But New York was then a young city. And it will be really interesting to ask ourselves how the old cities in the OECD countries can cope with this shock. To what extent will our pampered societies really be willing to expose themselves to these risks? And unfortunately, I don't believe that it will end in 2021.
Well, if I can add my two pennyworth here, is I don't think it will ever end, in the sense that we have flu pandemics still. And flu is just another form of COVID. It's just that we don't have COVID under control yet. There is a final question, which I think goes a little bit further in detail to the question that I put to you earlier. And it says, given the functional specialisation giving rise to agglomeration economies in London, e.g. the City for asset management, Mayfair for hedge funds, etc., can such agglomeration economies be supported without a concentrated centre?
That's a very good question, and I have no answer. I think
well, Kai, given that Switzerland is very well distributed in terms of the different very productive industries in different places, could we learn something from Switzerland, given that you worked in all these other countries as well?
Yeah, but you have to remember that similar to what he observes for London, that is true to some extent for Switzerland as well, because if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, that's heavily concentrated in Basel and around it. If you look at finance and insurance, a lot of it is in Zurich and in Zug. Watchmaking is Geneva and La Chaux-de-Fonds. So yes, that's a real issue, how we do that. And it's particularly true for industries where it's both intellectual knowledge as well as just physical skills. Think of the watchmaking. It's probably impossible to train somebody to make a very pricey watch by long distance training. Yeah, I think this is a big challenge, and we'll find out how much we can do. And that's why I'm so worried about these things, whether we can maintain the level of productivity we are used to.
And Corinne, maybe this is a good point actually to have a discussion among the two speakers and you, and then because just wondered whether Joe would like to come back to any of these issues or offer your thoughts and things like that.
I would really like to hear from Joe his comments on the agglomeration issues, because of the way in which that is intrinsically a land use implication for cities into the future.
Yeah, I can make a few comments. I certainly don't think that the kind of modeling that I was describing is going to easily provide answers to these questions we focused on now regarding either during or post-pandemic. But make a couple of observations on this discussion we've had about that Kai's raised regarding what's going to happen next. I guess I agree that we aren't going to get out of this quickly, and we've had all kinds of political debates about, vaccine will be ready tomorrow here, but it's been tied with politics. But the reality is that it's going to take a while, and may well have other waves. But I'm also suspicious that this is a dramatic change whereby the office buildings in Manhattan will never be occupied again. And I do think that the economic consequences of the pandemic have not yet begun to be felt, whether it's the cost of what we're doing, running at less than capacity, or the work productivity consequences associated with working from home. So we've been in this for 6 months. We probably have 2, 3, 4 times that to go through. to some extent, under the best of circumstances, at least another year. We aren't going to get through all of that without more visibility regarding whether there are productivity decreases, what the public is willing to put up with in order to minimize the adverse consequences of the disease. But my sense is that we're a long way from working from home, even for the office workers, in a way that approaches the productivity at work for more than short-term activity. So yeah, you can do the work that you have to do this week that's already defined, you know who you're dealing with, etc. Longer term, a little tougher, and so that gives some hope to the continued agglomeration effect associated with the higher density and interaction in the city. I also think I'm reminded from some of this discussion about how, as suburbs developed, then Starbucks in no small part sort of grew rapidly by providing suburban coffee shops that in the 90s and 2000s provided free Wi-Fi, and they'd have to develop their policies for people who would come there and camp out with their early gig economy and run their business from Starbucks and buy however minimal number of cappuccinos they had to for the day in order to be allowed to stay there. So I think that idea that we aren't going to get people working from home permanently, we're likely to get some mixture, some hybrid where people spend a little bit more time working from home and adjust their hours and days accordingly in ways that could be rich as far as taking care of kids and how they do household chores and that sort of thing. But there's going to be good reason to come together. Also that people value going to the city to work, not only to work and get paid, but because of the social interaction and engagement that they find as a result of being there, that's going to continue to be hard to duplicate in a lower density suburban setting. And you can look again and see what developers have done with shopping malls over the last couple of decades. And there's been much more focus on building destinations. They want to figure out how you can come there, and they can provide a variety of things that you can do to keep you there for a long time. And yet, I don't think most people would prefer to go to a suburban mall for the afternoon compared to being in downtown London or downtown any number of other places. So we have a lot to learn about what mix in the new world might look like, but I'd hesitate to push too far that we're going to have all these influences that do push towards sprawl, including autonomous vehicles that might provide cheaper mobility. But the people like going to the city. Now, again, all that said, I think the social equity issues regarding this is significant. If we move to a situation where only the poorest use the bus, that's a sort of downward spiral with respect to who pays for the transportation and the congestion consequences. And if we do that without paying attention to parking and road usage charge, we can paint a pretty dismal picture that we're heading down. So I do think that managing how we deal with this is going to put the onus on government planning, not necessarily financing even for all of it, but planning so that we get a pathway that is politically feasible, maybe in line with what I was saying about we need to pay more attention to how do we get from here to there with a lot of attention to some of the details, because it's pretty clear that some of things from the economic disruptions over the last few decades to the resistance of many places to do congestion pricing, that we could get off on a track that makes further progress even more politically difficult. And I think we've only begun to explore the possibilities and realities associated with what we've got ourselves into this year.
Yeah. But would you say that the areas with higher densities might actually need to require more investment at this point? Particularly those with very extensive public transport systems, like Kai said, for example, of the air conditioner issue and the issues of different.
Well, there is kind of a silver lining to
of
this.
contamination. So.
In a lot of the sort of world-class cities of which you've been talking about several, then rent gradient has been increasing its steepness, and the prices in the downtown have been very high. So some people are going to lose some money. The prices have come down, and I don't think they're going to recover very fast, and commercial prices have been hit. But the bottom isn't zero, and I don't think we're going to have to replace 100-story skyscrapers with 10-story high skyscrapers anytime soon. And the development community is certainly putting all its ingenuity into thinking about what kind of pathway keeps them from losing their shirts and regenerates the attractiveness associated with being downtown. Just think convention centers and all kinds of services, quite apart from the office worker, have taken a big hit. And you raised the same question about whether one can do without the convention center. And you can remember over the last few decades, after the 90s, the early 2000s, people were saying the convention business is dead. Don't build any new convention centers. Well, that didn't turn out to be good advice. Because of the death of distance and all that, and that people won't travel. Even now, I see much improved technology for managing conferences nowadays, but it isn't quite the same, especially with respect to networking and serendipitous conversations. We've got still a long way to go even there.
I think somebody in the audience pointed out that Dan Chapman argued that TOD, transit-oriented development, can work without an underground or a heavy rail connection. I think this is the point of the urban village. And the question becomes, how large does this urban village have to be to produce kind of the level of services which people want? I think this is this basic conflict that you need to have enough purchasing power in walking distance to make certain services attractive. And in particular, if you are then aiming at high-class services, you need quite a lot of purchasing power to allow those stores, restaurants, cafes to survive. And that's really the difference between, let's say, downtown Zurich, which is a place where you have that purchasing powers, versus some of the suburban places in Switzerland where you don't have that purchasing power. And I do believe, yes, you don't need a heavy rail line, but you need the purchasing power to produce the quality you want.
And Corinne, any final thoughts before we wrap up the session?
No, not really. I'm happy for you to wrap it up.
Yeah, well, I thought that the discussion just now had opened up several threads of discussions, and so if the speakers and colleagues who are in the audience are available, and that they're really welcome to join us for the post-session discussion, which will be in the second Zoom link. And so for that, our student host, Yue, has posted the link into the chat box, right? I'll give people a couple of minutes to get from there so that they don't have to
Where did you post it?
In the chat box.
In the Q&A?
It's next to the Q&A. There's also a chat box where you can see this. I think all the panelists and attendees.
Turn off the screen sharing and it'll be easier to see.
Okay, fine.
Well, if you click on the gray box of chat, then you see.
Okay, fine. I have to first stop sharing.
Link.
Before we go, Ying, though, can we
Yes.
Oh,
can
yes.
we formally thank Kai and Joe for
Absolutely
leading this extraordinarily stimulating conversation that's come from objective data and also from modelling to give us insights to what's coming, we imagine, in the future.
Yes, absolutely. So for all the inspirations and data to feed into this discussion, so for which we're really grateful. And thank you, both Joe and Kai. And also, we would like to thank you
for organizing the session. This is an example of our effort to do distance discussion beyond just reading somebody's paper. And I think it's getting a little bit better, and I'm glad you're able to do an AUM 2020 this year.
Well, this is a rather feeble effort, I must say, to allow people to have some agglomerative effects. And I don't know how far it will go. Certainly, our website now has developed web pages for each session with the abstracts and of the talks, plus further reading. And also, soon after each session, there's also going to be the uploading of the recordings for those who are too busy actually to listen in live. So I hope that that will actually provide some information. But I'm pretty sure that colleagues will still very much like to meet face to face, and I hope that in the future we'll be able to do that as well. But really grateful for both speakers and Corinne for really stimulating discussion. And I hope that this will continue in the post-session talks that as we're going to move to, right? So, and thank you all. And I think this is now really the time to close this session. And so the next session this week will be a session by Professor Jeffrey Hewings and also Professor Alex Annas, looking at urban economic modeling. And I look forward to seeing you on Thursday this week. Thank you. And yeah, you probably have to press the button so that we all leave this one and join the next one.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Yeah, bye-bye.